Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us for our talk with Kathy today. We have a couple housekeeping items to go through. We do ask that you keep yourselves muted, and you can have your video on or off, whichever you'd prefer, but make sure that you keep your systems muted during the presentation. There is a chat box. If you have any questions throughout, you can put your question in the chat box. We will try to address them throughout the presentation, but at the very end, we will absolutely have a question and answer time that we can go through everything. My name is Tammy Echeverria. I'm with the Department of Parks and Recreation, and we do reserve the right to stop the video feed of any participant or to close out the presentation at any time if we deem that any of the activity is inappropriate. At this time, I'm going to turn everything over to Kathleen, and thank you again for joining us.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on this blustery afternoon. It's a perfect day, I guess, to talk about winter interest in the landscape. And so today we're going to talk about frosty flowers and landscape plants that you can include for more interest in your landscape this time of the year. So I will try and keep an eye on the chat if you have questions. Otherwise, I'll go through them at the end. And so we'll get started with this. And let's see, first I'll share. Oops, wrong thing. Okay. Here we go, and play from start. Okay, so you all should be able to see this now. And so at the Ambler Arboretum, so I'm the director of the Ambler Arboretum of Temple University, which of course is located right in Upper Dublin. And one of the areas that we focus on is thinking about plants and their interest, their seasonal interest and their beauty that they bring during the winter months. And so I consider the off season sort of like Halloween till Easter. And so or maybe the March 1st, like that time frame. And so these plants are plants that are interesting in those times of the year. And it makes a lot of sense on our campus that we have a lot of plants that have this type of feature. And that's because we are a college campus. And if you think about when semesters run, our students, we don't have a huge student population in the summer. Our students are starting now, it's the spring semester, but it goes from January to the end of April. So it hardly gets much spring in there at all. It's really winter that we're teaching about plants and landscaping and landscape architecture. And then again, from August until December. So it's a lot of that off season that we're focused on. And so we wanted it to be interesting for the students. We want to be able to show them different parts of plants and different types of plants. It's also, though, the Arboretum started out as the Pennsylvania School of Horticulture for Women in 1911. And one of the designers of some of our spaces is Beatrix Farrand. And for those of you who don't know, she was the sole woman founding member of the Society for Landscape Architects, the American Society of Landscape Architects. And she was well known for her college campus designs and large estate designs, but one of her focuses, multiple focuses in design was winter interest for similar reasons that we've been focusing on it on our campus. And so though she didn't design the gardens in our space, it's nice to have that connection with her. And so we think about this a lot. So I will say a few things about the plants in that we're going to talk about today. They're not all native plants. So just so you know that there's some plants in here that are not native. And so if you're looking to just garden with all natives, many of these won't apply. And all of these you can find, or most of these you can find at the Arboretum. And the Arboretum strives to be a place of inspiration for our neighbors, for our community. So we want you to come in and take a look at all different seasons and see what's blooming and what's interesting, and to take inspiration from that, and then go support your local garden center, buy some plants and put them in. And you know, our plants are labeled, and so you can figure out what they are, when they look great, and then go, and what they'll look like in larger sizes than you might find in the garden center. And then you can plant them and enjoy them like we do in the Arboretum. So, so with that, we'll get to talking about some of your options. Now, when we're thinking about landscape plants for our winter wonderland, I started my career out of grad school. I worked in Newark, New Jersey, doing school and community gardening, and eventually built a 1 acre teaching garden right in the center of Newark, New Jersey, which is still there. But one of my goals was to have flowers in the garden blooming 12 months out of the year. And Newark benefits, so to speak, from an urban heat island effect. So we have warmer climate than the immediate suburbs there. And that gave us some leeway in what we could experiment with. And so part of this frosty flowers and having winter interest is that you can take advantage of microclimates in your landscape. So if there's some warmer parts of your landscape, a southern corner, protected by a couple of walls, something like that, you could take advantage and try out some different plants. But it is possible in this area to have flowers in your garden 12 months out of the year. We do in the Arboretum. And so we know that you can too, where you're at. But I don't think you could do it with all native plants. So just putting that out there. So a lot of us, when we're thinking of winter interest, we are thinking about evergreens, right? I remember working at a garden center and people would say, well, I want winter interest. And to them, that meant evergreens. And usually it's like some green round blob, boxwood or something like that, that to them that was interesting. And interesting just meant green year round. And so the first thing I want to talk about is that idea that these evergreens are green year round. And so we can think about evergreens and conifers, which are cone-bearing plants. And instead of just going with the traditional green, whatever it is, think of all the different options that are out there. And at the Ambler Arboretum, we have this terrific conifer collection, nationally recognized, I'm excited to say, that you can get inspiration for and just see the various textures and colors that you can get in these evergreen shrubs. So, so sure, winter interest, we can think evergreens, right? So they always have their needles on them. They always have some color there. So we have here blue spruce. We have another type of spruce here. We have a cryptomeria, and you just see these different textures and colors. This is a hinoki cypress back here with its yellow foliage, Atlas cedar back here with its blue. So here, some more textures and colors of evergreens. So we're not just limited to these green blobs. There's tons of textures and shapes, colors that you can get from these cone-bearing plants. So we can think differently about those also. The ones featured in this collection here are dwarf conifers, and dwarf conifers really just speaks to that they're dwarf in relation to the species that you would find out in the wild. So if the species get 150 feet tall and the dwarf only gets 75 feet tall, that's still a really big plant for a home landscape. So you need to know what these plants are going to do. And again, visiting the Arboretum and checking out what's going on there with mature plants will give you an idea of how big these plants will ultimately get before you buy one for your house, but also shows you some nice color combinations and texture combinations that you can look at, because that also adds winter interest into your landscape. Having evergreens in your landscape is beneficial to wildlife that's there. If you feed birds, it gives birds a place to rest and protect themselves away from the feeders. So there's great reasons to have evergreens, but evergreens aren't the only option for winter interest in your landscape. And that's what I'm hoping to highlight today in this talk. Additionally, we have to maybe reconsider what we think is interesting in the landscape. And so here we have a rhododendron, and this is a native rhododendron. And notice what it's doing. The leaves are curling here. And that is a function of the plant trying to protect itself. It's called thermonasty. And basically the underside of the leaves are covered with stomates or pores. through which water and gases exchange for the plant. And in the winter, when the plant isn't getting a ton of water because it's not raining, it's not snowing, the ground's frozen, it can't get water, it curls up those leaves around those stomates to protect the water from leaving the plant so it doesn't desiccate and die. And so it's a perfectly natural process. As soon as it's nice and warm and there's water flowing in the ground, they'll open back up, they'll get shiny again, and they'll function just normally. And so we can also think about, what else do these plants do besides just sit there and be green, right? We'll get flowers in the spring from this, but also let's take some time to learn about the seasonal changes and embrace the seasonal changes of the plants that we have. There's a product that you can buy and spray on the leaves to keep them from doing this. It puts a waxy coating on the leaves, but really there's no need to. These plants are just doing what they're supposed to do. They're protecting themselves, they're functioning as they should. So no need to spend money and put a product on there. Just embrace it and learn more about it and consider it part of your winter interest in your landscape. We have also to consider our seed heads, right? And what our plants do in their dormancy. So it's best practice for the environment, for beneficial insects, for pollinators, to not clean up your gardens in the fall, to leave the seed heads and the debris of the garden through the fall and through the winter to provide shelter and overwintering space for lots of different animals that are beneficial in your landscape. And so we can grow to appreciate the beauty of seed heads and their shape, and also the birds that come and visit them to get the seeds from them. This is pycnanthemum seed heads here, which is mountain mint. And here you see a whole lot of mountain mint there, but the shapes and textures add something interesting to the landscape too. So we can think beyond our evergreens, right? And for some people, this is very uncomfortable. You just want to go in and cut this all back and get rid of it and have a nice clean slate to start in the spring. But really, there's beneficial insects overwintering in here. There's adult moths overwintering in here. There's birds that find shelter in here. This is a really great space. It's an oasis in a frozen tundra, of other landscapes that have been perfectly cleaned up. And so these types of spaces are really important. And by leaving them up, not only do you have this textural diversity, you're also welcoming wildlife diversity for the future by leaving it up. This was taken at Meadowbrook Farms. Some of you may know that area. It's the public garden of the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. And this was taken in February. And notice that the grasses here and even an empty container is a focal point, right? But these grasses are dormant. They're brown. They're kind of that straw color, but they still add interest into the landscape. And so you don't want to cut everything back, because these are still pretty. Some of them just collapse in the winter and they look like garbage, and so you just clean those up because nobody wants to see it. But work with the plants, and if you're thinking about design and winter interest, then design with dormancy in mind. When you buy these plants, they're at their epitome of beauty, right? That's when the garden centers can sell them. They're full of berries or full of flowers. But before you buy that plant, look at it and go, what are you going to do in the rest of the seasons? And pick the ones that offer the most diversity of interest in those seasons. So what is this grass going to look like in the winter? And design with that dormancy in mind. And you can really add some really intriguing and interesting details into your landscape. Here again, this is an accidental combination that I thought was stunning that I happened upon in the Arboretum. So this was taken in January. And this combination is of dormant plants. So here we have the hydrangea arborescens, which is the smooth hydrangea. It's our native hydrangea. So the flower bracts stick around throughout the winter. They're persistent. They sort of hang on all winter. And then here we have the deep purple coloration of PJM rhododendron. So PJM rhododendron is this small rounded rhododendron that gets these true purple flowers, which are just standout. They're so beautiful in the spring, but in the winter, their leaves turn this nice purple, dark purple bronze color. And I just thought this combination was so beautiful. So when you're designing, you can even think, you say, okay, well, how do these flowers look together if they're blooming at the same time? Or how do these textures look together? But think about the dormancy too. This is an accidental combination. I don't believe it was intentional, but I would repeat this in my own landscape because I just love how this looks in the winter. So we can think about plants in that way too for winter interest. And of course, twigs become exposed in the winter, right? On our deciduous plants, they drop their leaves and then there's a bunch of sticks there. And so if we have to have a bunch of sticks around, let's look for sticks that offer some interest. This particular one is Cornus sanguinea, winter flame, and it really does look like a little bonfire in the garden next to the bench, and especially with this evergreen backdrop here, this really shines. It's amazing. It has yellow, oranges, corals, all kinds of colors, and it's a shrub dogwood, so it just suckers and it just makes this big colony. So we have one on either side of this bench, and they're really beautiful. And you could pick the red twig dogwood too, or the yellow twig dogwood. So there's lots of options out there, but why have something that's just going to have brown twigs, or not? Why not take advantage of this? Also beautiful in twig is Acer palmatum sangokaku. So this is a Japanese maple called coral bark maple, and you can see why. Through the summer, this has chartreusey, pretty typical Japanese maple leaves. It's an upright Japanese maple, and the branches are kind of pinkish red in color. But then after it drops its leaves and it gets really cold out, these branches just turn more and more pink and coral through the winter. And again, with an evergreen backdrop behind it, they really stand out. With snow on the ground, they just really stand out like these pink, bright pink trees in the landscape, and you didn't have to paint them or anything. They're just naturally that way. So you could pick a regular old Japanese maple that has brown twigs, or you could select this one for this additional season of interest, right? And if you want to go evergreen, that you want to have evergreens in your landscape, you can think beyond the conifers and the needled evergreens, and you can think to some herbaceous plants that can offer different textures and also be evergreen. So this is Polystigma cross-stitchoides. This is our native Christmas fern. And for those of you that live in this region, Christmas fern is pretty prevalent throughout our woodlands, dry woodland, rocky areas. And the way we know it, if you see it, well, first of all, it's evergreen, but if you see it has that little bump on those leaflets there. And I learned this when I was in school, is like thumbs up for Christmas. So Christmas fern, thumbs up for Christmas. So you'll know it when you see it. And, this is in my yard, just a clump of them. We'll ignore the invasive English ivy that I just saw there. But this nice clump of them, and this persists through the winter, and it adds this nice little kind of almost tropical feeling texture, but they stay evergreen. They pop up through the snow and they just look really nice. So, so we can think beyond the evergreen shrubs when we're talking evergreen. It's another native evergreen. So this was taken in December. This is Waldsteinia fragroides, the false strawberry. This turns a beautiful red bronze color in the fall, and then will green up, or actually it'll turn red bronze sort of late winter. And then it'll green up again in the spring. So it holds this green well into the winter, and then turns this really great reddish bronze color, and then will green up again. So just a nice native ground cover to have, and to have evergreen there. Our sedges are great options also for adding winter interest and things that still stay green through the winter. So thinking beyond the green blob. This is Carex plantanginea. This is seersucker sedge, which is one of my favorites. I'm a sedge nerd, a Carex nerd. I just love them. There's so many uses for them. Any place in the landscape, there's a sedge for that. So just so you know. And there's blue ones, so you can add that color difference. So, and they're evergreen, so they last through the winter. You just cut them back in the spring, and they'll send up the new growth. And so you just leave them up. You don't have to worry about cutting them back in the fall or anything like that. And then with our evergreens, you can choose also evergreens that offer more than just being green through the entire year. So here we have Pinus bungiana. This is lacebark pine. And this is a smaller growing pine. Often it's multi-stemmed. As you can see here, there's multiple stems at the trunk. But it's kind of thin growing. It's not super dense needled here, but the bark is just really beautiful. And so you can choose your evergreens that also give you something else to look at, right? So here's the bark, and then here's the tree as a whole. So this is lacebark pine. And of course, bark is something that we take into consideration when we are thinking about plants for winter interest in our landscapes. And so probably the poster child for the most awesome bark on a tree goes to the Betula nigra, which is the river birch. And we have a beautiful grove of these, and we have some pretty mature ones on campus. But look at this peeling bark. This is what it's supposed to do. It's exfoliating bark, and plants exfoliate for a number of reasons. Sometimes they're in a place where lichens and other things might settle on them. And so they have this exfoliating bark to kind of shed whatever's growing on them at the time. Most adaptations are protective in some way. But it's really ornamental too. You have these tans, maroons, browns, salmons, and this just peeling bark. And some people it might not be for everybody, but it does add interest in the landscape. Also, these nooks and crannies in the bark provide spaces for beneficial insects, moths, butterfly, caterpillars, to overwinter too, a little protected space. So they serve multiple purposes. Same with shagbark hickory. So you probably have seen these if you've walked around in the woods or explored around here at all. It's a native in our landscape. And the shagbark hickory too has really interesting bark, great yellow fall color, nuts you could eat if you wanted to, and nice big shade tree. And then it has this bark that also serves as a habitat. So, and I just learned that nuthatches will go and store their seeds underneath these bark flaps too. But moths and insects will overwinter. Even bats sometimes will hang out underneath the flaps in this bark. So not only interesting for us, for our eyes, but also interesting that we're adding diversity to our landscape. And what I love about thinking about adding seasonal interest to your landscape is that by doing that, you're increasing the diversity of your landscape, which also increases the diversity of the animals that you'll be supporting. So it's like a win for everybody. This beautiful bark belongs to Stewartia pseudocamellia. There are a number of Stewartia species, including native Stewartia species, but this is a non-native Korean Stewartia, it's called. And white flowers in the spring, or later in the spring or early summer, big white flowers, and with a yellow center. They kind of like a fried egg flower. And then followed by these seed capsules, but this bark is always beautiful. A gorgeous fall color on this too. This is really a 4 seasons of interest plant. So again, when you're choosing your plants, just ask the plant, look at the tag, ask the expert at the garden center, what else does this do? And so when we think winter interest, we think evergreen leaves, we think interesting bark, we think great twigs, and we probably think about berries too. So what fruits can we introduce into the landscape that will be beautiful to us, but also useful to wildlife? And so here we have Ilex opaca, the American holly in fruit, which is a native. It's pretty popular, fairly easy to grow, slow growing, but fairly easy to grow. And we get these beautiful red berries on it. We also have winterberry. This was taken in December. So we have winterberry, and notice the clumps of bright red berries. They also come in orange cultivars, which notice this is taken in January. The birds don't like the orange ones. They only eat the red ones. So thinking about how these are going to be used and if they'll be useful to wildlife, if that's of interest to you, is important too. Not everything gets eaten or is preferred. So, so we think berries, right? And here we have this crazy plant. This is Euonymus atropurpureus. This was taken in November. And this is the American wahoo, the fruits of American wahoo. It's a cousin of the invasive burning bush. So if you're familiar with burning bush, Euonymus elatus, this is related to that. It's also related to hearts of burstin, if you're familiar with that shrub, but really interesting fruits that persist into the winter. So, and then you can see here, it still had some fall color on the leaf hanging on, and then this gorgeous fruit. So we do think this cat, sorry. So we do think this, we think fruits, branches, bark, evergreen leaves, right, for winter interest. More fruit, this is hawthorn here that persists. And so we have all of those options for seasonal interest. But what I'm talking to you today about is flowers and how you can incorporate flowers into your landscape in all the seasons or in winter. And so we're going to start with some bulbs. And I'm going to try and tell you when I photographed these so that you have some idea about the duration of the displays. And so this is Iris reticulata, netted iris. You plant this as a bulb in the fall, just like you would do daffodils and tulips. It's short, it's probably only about 4 inches tall, little iris. But these are blooming on March 1st, and we can get these blooming earlier, even in February, if it's against a stone wall or in a protected space where the sun hits first. You can get these blooming in February, and you can use those microclimates in your landscape to manipulate the bloom time a little bit. So they're just such a cheerful kind of first flower to see in the landscape, and it's really surprising, you know, to see this iris out blooming in the winter. So with a combination of bulbs, trees, and shrubs, you can have flowers 12 months out of the year in your garden. Of course, crocus, you're probably familiar with. And so these bloom early. Also, we've had these blooming in February and January sometimes in our microclimates in the Arboretum. This is a species tulip. One thing we've noticed about species tulips, so they're smaller, they are less likely to be eaten by deer for some reason. I'm not sure why, and they bloom much earlier. And so we have started putting in a lot of these in the Arboretum. And species tulips just mean that they haven't been hybridized, and they're more like the tulips that you would find in Turkey and that area where tulips are native to. They haven't been changed into that big softball-sized red tulip that we're used to seeing and that the deer love to eat. We also have, this was taken March 1st also, but this is Aranthus hymelis. This is another bulb, winter aconite it's called, not native. The deer don't bother it because it's toxic. The squirrels don't dig it up either. And but these are some of the first bulbs, first spring bulbs to come up. These are in the woods. If you had them in a warmer area, we have them in a courtyard, and they come up probably a couple weeks earlier than the ones in the woods in the shade. And snowdrops, galanthus. You can see they hang their heads down, so you have to get really close up to them to see how beautiful they are. But this is galanthus. These were taken, this was taken in February 20th. So bulbs are an easy way to get flowers in the winter in your garden, for sure. One of my favorite plants is the skunk cabbage, Symplocarpus fetidus. And here it is in bloom. And this was taken March 11th, full bloom here. And these flowers are thermogenic. That means that this plant creates its own heat. And it does that so it can be a warming spot for its pollinators, because pollinators are cold-blooded. So in order for them to move and function, they need to have warm temperatures. So this plant can actually increase the temperature right around it, almost 30 degrees, which is incredible just through a chemical process. And the leaves are just starting to come up here, which means these flowers are just getting ready to be finished. These flowers are out for a couple of weeks before the leaves start to emerge. And so this is one you'll find growing wild. It's hard to transplant. You don't usually find it in the garden centers because skunk cabbage is a hard sell for people. It needs a marketing campaign, a rebranding campaign, but they're out there and they're beautiful. In fact, some are starting to pop up already now. Hellebores, they're popular around here. They're deer resistant because they're toxic. The deer don't bother them. And they bloom in the winter. So the black hellebore that you see here that photo was taken in December, and the white one was taken in January. So there's a number of different species of hellebore, and you can have hellebores that will bloom from December all the way through till April. So depending on the type you get. So you can have those flowers in here. This one was taken in March, this hellebore here. So you can get that extension. They're called Lenten roses or Christmas roses, and that helps you know when that particular species is going to bloom. This is Acer rubrum, the red maple, and this is blooming on April 10th. And so that's kind of stretching our season of interest, but you can see everything around it is dormant still. And we don't really think about maples as flowering trees or ornamental flowering trees. But here you see the puffs of red flowers on the red maple branch. And the other thing that's great about these and all of these early flowering winter flowers is that when our honeybees, when there's a nice warm day in February, like we get so often, there'll be these 60-degree days that tease us about spring coming, and the bees come out and they visit flowers. And so the more that we can put out there that's blooming in the winter, the more options there are for the bees on those warm days. And including red maple in your landscape is one of the best things you can do for our native pollinators and the honeybees alike, because it provides this early spring source of nectar and pollen. And so, and they're pretty, and in clumps, you'll see a haze of red or a haze of orange or yellow, depending on the type of maple. And they can be really pretty. A lot of these flowers, admittedly, you need to get close up and personal to appreciate. So they're not all super showy, but they are flowers blooming in the winter. I think the other thing you can consider in the landscape is the buds of the plants. We're going to get to more flowers, but the buds of plants. So here we have a magnolia bud. This is a saucer magnolia bud, and it has these protective scales on it because the flower bud is there from the summer before all the way through until the next spring. So it needs to be protected from all the elements, from the freezing and thawing. And so it does this by having this thick scales covered with hairs, and that's all protection. So those can also be ornamental in your landscape. So you can think about, what do these buds look like before they come out? And it's really fun to have these fuzzy magnolia buds. I think he kind of looks like Baby Yoda here. I don't know, maybe you can see it, but yeah, that's what he reminded me of, that bud scale. All right. So, and then we have these combinations where we can get early flowers and great bark going. And let's see, I just have a question. Oh, magnolia, what type of magnolia? That was a saucer magnolia. Magnolia X Solangiana in that particular bud. So this is Parodia persica. This is the Persian ironwood. It's related to witch hazels and fothergillas, if you're familiar with those. But Parodia persica has this terrific bark, exfoliating bark as it ages. And then it has these maroon flower buds. The buds themselves are black and fuzzy and really distinct, and they stand out from the tree because they're so dark. But then as they open, they have these maroon flower buds here. And this is really all they do, but they expand. And this happens in late March or early April. So you have the great bark, you have these terrific flowers on here, and then it has really great fall color too. Parodia persica is an underused plant in the landscape, I feel. It's not native, but it is, it's got so many good qualities to it that I think it should be used more. And then we move on to Camellia japonica. So Japanese camellia related to tea plants. There's also Camellia sasanqua. Camellia sasanqua blooms in the fall, and Camellia japonica blooms in the very early spring or late winter. These are evergreen. There's a breeding program going on that they're working on more hardy plant varieties that won't need the protection, but generally these need some protection so that the flower buds don't freeze and die and that the plant doesn't freeze and die. But you can, if you have a microclimate in your landscape, you can have these, and you can have these beautiful flowers in March or April. They're a little bit later on the spectrum, but and then the sasanqua, the fall ones, that November, December bloom time is really special. This is February blooms. This is Edgeworthia chrysantha, paper bush it's called. And I just love these buds. Speaking of buds for winter interest, look at how velvety they are. They're kind of a greenish white color, and they droop down like this. Even the stems of the buds are fuzzy. It's silvery. The sun catches them just right. The shrub just gets covered with them, and they're really beautiful. And then in the spring, in February, they'll open up to this fragrant cluster of yellow flower. It depends on the cultivar, but yellow or white flowers, but super fragrant. And here, this is a picture at the Scott Arboretum. And you can see here, it's just blooming a lot. The buds are starting to swell, but there's not a lot going on. Some early flowers here, still dormant, but this thing is blooming its head off, right? But notice where it is. It's in a protected area. So it's got all of this heat being reflected off of these stone walls and this stone floor up onto it. It does need that. If this were just planted out in the open in a landscape situation, more often than not, the buds are killed by our winters here. But if you have them in a protected spot, you can get this beautiful display. Notice here it also suckers. So you do have to manage that too. Or you can just let it sucker, that's fine. But, the name of this shrub is Edgeworthia chrysantha, or paper bush, it's called. It is related to Daphne. It's poisonous, so the deer don't tend to bother it.
Kathleen, can I interrupt you just for a moment? There are two questions in the chat box. One is what type of magnolia? Mm-hmm. And the other one is, what is the name of the shrub again? Okay, so this particular shrub is Edgeworthia chrysantha, the paper bush. And then that magnolia was Magnolia excellengiana, the saucer magnolia. All right. And so multiple seasons of interest or multiple interest going on in the winter. This is Berberis aquifolium, also known as Mahonia aquifolium. And this is the winter color of its leaves. So this whole thing is a leaf. These are the leaflets. It looks like a holly, but it's not a holly. It's a Mahonia. And this beautiful purple color is what happens in the winter, and then it'll green up again in the, it'll green up again in the spring. It would turn bright green, like you wouldn't even know that it had this purple color, but it also flowers in the winter. And so here you can see the flowers of the Mahonia in the winter. So you'll start to see flowers on this in late February or early March. And you'll see bees and pollinators all over it as soon as it opens. This is evergreen, not native, but a nice addition. When you're choosing evergreen plants, why not choose something that has some flowers too? This is Hamamelis virginiana. This was taken November 2nd, and this. You can see there's a pollinator here, and this is what it does. So this is our native Virginiana, is our native witch hazel that we would find in the woods around here. And so it blooms in the fall. There's also Hamamelis vernalis, which is a spring blooming
witch hazel that's native to southeastern United States, but will grow just fine in here. And that'll bloom in March, and also extend your season of flowering time in your landscape, right? So by adding diversity of flowers to our landscape, we can also support the pollinators that are around us, right? But sometimes they're blooming and there is no pollinator for it, because they're not because the plants aren't native, and so the animal that would have been pollinating it at that particular time doesn't exist here. But some insects do take advantage of that, and yeah, and so and again, our skunk cabbage is out there attracting pollinators by warming up. So these plants that are blooming in the winter do provide a service. It's not just beautiful for us or something we should be thinking of because we'll be delighted by it, but it's also providing a service, right? Same with the hellebores are interesting because they flower in the winter, but they don't they rely mainly on bumblebees for pollination. And of course, the bumblebees aren't really out when they're flowering around us. But as the temperatures warm up and the hellebores remain out, so when they're first blooming, you might not see pollinators. But as the flowers get older and the temperatures warm up, then you will see bumblebees going to this as the activity increases. This is Hemamelis mollis. This is a non-native witch hazel. This was blooming January 25th. And again, it's not a huge display that you're going to notice from afar, but putting this near windows or doorways so that you can appreciate them on your daily travels throughout a landscape is really nice. And they have this spicy fragrance. And, you know, if there's any pollinators out on a warm day, this can support them too. The buds on the witch hazel, notice they're called naked buds. They have no scales. These are the leaves that will emerge, and they're covered with lots of hairs to protect them from the weather. This is Hemamelis vernalis. This is taken in February. I always think of these like party streamers, or those things that you blow on and they unfurl. I don't know what you call those things, but that's what they remind me of. They just sort of unfurl in these little fireworks here. There are winter moths that visit these for food. This is one of my favorites. This is Hemamelis gelina, taken in February. And these were blooming so much that on a warm day in February, that our bees from our apiary on campus, we have beekeeping classes and we have beehives on campus. The bees were just covering this. I mean, there were dozens and dozens of honeybees all over this shrub when it was blooming. And the beekeeper noticed and called and asked what was blooming, because the bees were coming back with this reddish orange pollen, and he wasn't sure where it was coming from. And so they were in such full bloom. And it was such a nice day that the bees just went out and foraged. And so by having these available to them and open, even though they're not native plants, honeybees aren't native either, they were able to help sustain the hive even in the winter. So that was pretty great. We were very excited about that. This is one called, it's Hemamelis vernalis amethyst. So it's kind of purplish flowers on there. But again, blooming in February into March on this one too. So you have those options. Oh, this terrible picture, I'm sorry. So this is Coreopsis, which is called winter hazel. So we just talked about witch hazels, but these are winter hazels. And you can see this, the habit, the point of this picture is to show the habit of it. It's a larger shrub, upright, nothing really special about the twigs, but they bloom in February into March. So they have these beautiful dangling clusters of flowers in here, February into March. So you have the space for it. It's a really nice addition, especially if you can back it up with something evergreen so that these flowers really stand out, because they can get lost in the landscape if there's not that backdrop. Here we have Chimonanthus praecox. the name is the common name is escaping me right now. I'm sorry about that. But this is, again, blooming in late January. I took this photo late January, and it's just a surprise. You might think it's a forsythia when you're out and about, but it's way too early for a forsythia. And it's a beautiful plant, and not very common. You might find it difficult to find it in the landscape, but if you do, or in garden centers, but if you go to specialty nurseries, you'll be able to find these. And so it's just a really splendid addition to the landscape. This one was taken at the Barnes Arboretum of St. Joseph's University. A native plant that I think is underused in the landscape is leatherwood. This is Dirca palustris. And here you see what it does when it's dormant, right before the leaves come out, the flowers emerge, these yellow drooping flowers, bright in these clusters of 3 or 4 here. It's called leatherwood because the branches are super flexible and you can almost tie them in knots. But not used a lot, not planted a lot, but does offer this winter interest. Anything that blooms before its leaves emerge, you can consider something to add to that winter interest category in your landscape. Here's another Mahonia. This is Mahonia bealii, more coarse textured, kind of robust plant, bigger leaves and a bigger flower cluster. So the other Mahonia that we looked at had a compressed flower cluster, lots of flowers all together. These flower clusters, I took this in February too, these flower clusters are elongated. So they're almost 8 to 10 inches tall, and with these yellow fragrant flowers all along the branches of the flower, and fragrant, and also attracts pollinators. So really nice evergreen. Notice the red stems here. They look like holly leaves, but not holly again. Evergreen, red stems, yellow flowers, all happening in winter. Really nice to be able to take that in the landscape. Lots of these plants you can find in our winter garden. We have the Phil and Barbara Albright winter garden at the Arboretum. And so a lot of these plants are on display there. So if you're wondering about what they look like in person or full size, or what they smell like when they're flowering, I encourage you to come and visit them. This is Osmanthus heterophyllus goshiki. So it's Holly Osmanthus is the name of this. This is, I took this in January, but they start flowering in November. And that's their primary time of flower, is in the fall. The super fragrant flower. Sorry about the phone. It doesn't ring all day. So super fragrant flower, the whole garden fills up with this scent, and it's in the fall. So it's really unexpected. Evergreen holly-like leaves, slow growing compact shrub, can be used for hedging, but these great flowers. They're hidden though. So you actually get more of a scent and a fragrance in the garden than you do notice the flowers blooming. And then you kind of search around for what is that good smell. And then you find these little flowers. Another one you might not be familiar with, this is Viburnum ferrari. This is the fragrant viburnum, or winter viburnum. And ours is blooming right now, actually. It started last week, just sending out some initial flowers. I have this theory that these early blooming plants send out a test flower to see if it's not too cold to bloom yet. And then if it is, like this one was burnt up a little bit, maybe by the freeze, then they hold off, they pause, and they don't open up until later. It's just my harebrained theory, but so there's some of those test flowers out now at the Arboretum, and it'll open up in February into March, but it has these beautiful clusters of pink flowers, very fragrant, great fall color on this viburnum. And interestingly, the stems of the leaves smell like green peppers when you crush them. So lots of different things going on with that. It's a tall viburnum. It needs some room to grow, but beautiful pink flowers. This was taken in February, both of these photos. And this is Erica X Darlinensis. This is our heath, flowering heath. or winter flowering heath. These start blooming in November and they don't stop flowering until March, April. And there's just flowers, yellow flowers, white flowers, and pink flowers through that whole time. These are ground cover. They're only about 6 or 8 inches tall, and they get about maybe 2 feet wide in a clump. They need very particular circumstances. They want to be well drained. They're growing on a berm in our conifer garden. And so they're well drained. They don't want clayey soils or wet soils. They won't do well. But if you have a place for these, like a rock garden or something like that, it's just so nice to walk past them and see these flowers blooming. And they're evergreen, and they're herbaceous plant. They're not a shrub. Well, they're a woody plant that you treat like a herbaceous plant. So they feel more like a perennial, but they are a woody plant. This is Sarcococa hookeriana nana. This is sweet box, it's called. And again, these are flowers that aren't so showy. They happen in the axils of the plant. So if this plant has these long lance-like leaves, it's evergreen. Deer don't bother it. It gets about 1.5 feet tall and just spreads in this dense clump. It's a great evergreen ground cover. It, I think I said the deer don't bother it, so that's good. You can tell what my focus is at the Arboretum is deer. But these axillary flowers, they're apetalous, no petals on these flowers. So it's just the reproductive parts that are here. And again, this is another one like the osmanthus that's so fragrant. You smell this before you see the flowers of this plant. You walk in, you're going, what is so fragrant? And then you find these. And so this photo was taken on March 1st and it's well into flower. So it starts blooming in February. And of course it depends, the flowering time depends on the seasons, the sunlight, the rain, all of that. But all of these are pretty reliable in that off season that we don't think of for flowers. These are the leaves of the Sarcococa covered in frost. I don't see any flowers in that picture. Winter jasmine is pretty common. You can find that in a lot of places. That has been blooming since late fall in the garden. It'll bloom sporadically from November all the way through winter on nice warm sunny days, especially in a protected sunny location, and just keep going into March and April. This particular picture was taken on March 1st. It has green stems. It grows like not like a vine, but it arches over. It doesn't grow up as a shrub. It hangs down and arches over a structure. So we have it above a stone wall, kind of arching over it. Green four-sided branches, and the buds before the flowers emerge are a two-tone maroon and green, which are also ornamental, not native. This is Lonicera fragrantissima, which is a shrub honeysuckle. Lots of shrub honeysuckles are considered invasive. This one I haven't found on invasive plant lists, but I'd be leery of planting it anywhere just because of how our shrub honeysuckles behave in the wild. But I do include this one because it's one of the favorites of my students. This was taken March 1st. You can see there's buds getting ready to open. There's flowers that have already been. So it started blooming in February. And the flowers smell like Fruit Loops. If you've ever eaten Fruit Loops or opened a box of Fruit Loops, you know what that smell is. This plant smells just like it. And my students call it the Fruit Loop plant. Then we have Abeliophyllum distichum, which is the white forsythia. It's not technically a forsythia, but it has a habit like forsythia and the flower similar to forsythia, and it blooms white and fragrant before forsythia does. So that's another one you can include. We don't have this one at the Arboretum, but it would be a nice addition to our winter landscape. You can find it at the Barnes Arboretum, though. They have it on display there. And then one that I didn't learn until I started working at the Arboretum, but I fell in love with, and it's one of my new favorite plants, is the pink pussy willow. This is Salix grassostyla Mount Aso. There's also a black form with these just pitch black catkins on them, which is really stunning and dramatic. But so here you see, if you're familiar with pussy willow, you know it gets these really fuzzy catkins. And so these are bright pink. And this was taken February 20th here, this photo. So these are the catkins just emerging. Notice the scales that were around the buds that made the buds. are still there. So this is emerging, super fuzzy, bright pink. The sun hits it just right. It's like magic fairy garden land in your landscape. It's a willow, so it suckers, and you can keep it cut back and shorter. It'll get about 5 to 6 feet tall if you don't do that. And then as the catkins expand, look what they do. They expose these stamens and pistils, and they're two-tone. And so you go from this pink fuzzball here to this orange and yellow and gray fuzz here. So it transitions through the season. So this is March 1st. So February 20th to March 1st, the difference on those plants. You can see all the pollen being released here. And so this, I just love this one. And so with that, I know I went through those fast. I'm happy to answer any questions, and to hopefully have inspired you to think more about what else these plants do that we pick for our landscapes, and how we can add interest and flowers into our gardens for the entire year. And we can have flowers in our garden the whole year round, just like we can have robins in our gardens the whole year round now, right? So yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions, and I really do hope you'll come and visit the Arboretum and check out our winter interest plants. Now is a great time to be there.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. If anybody has any questions, you can, again, either put it in the chat box, or if you'd like to unmute and ask a question, you can do that as well. All right, let's see. We did just have a question. It says, can we obtain printouts of the plants you discussed? Fascinating. Thank you so much.
Tammy, if you have the registration, I can send a handout of the plant list.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I will make sure to get you all of everybody's contact information. This presentation has been recorded, so we will actually post this on the Upper Dublin Parks and Recreation website, as well as on our Parks and Recreation YouTube channel. So you'll be able to review it through that as well.
Cool. And I saw another question about where is the Albright Garden? The Albright Winter Garden is part of the formal garden